He didn't think. He just ran into the smoke, cutting the seatbelt and dragging the man from the crumpled car. Mason Briggs had no idea that the bloodied stranger he'd just saved wore the patch of a brotherhood feared by many, but loyal beyond measure, the Hell's Angels. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you are watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories. The screech of twisting metal cut through the quiet back road like a gunshot. Mason Briggs slammed his truck into park, heart hammering. Smoke curled up from a sedan lodged against a tree, its hood crumpled, glass glittering across the asphalt. Inside, a man slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. Mason didn't hesitate. Years of raising his boy alone had taught him that doing the right thing didn't wait for perfect timing. He yanked open the buckled driver's door, the heat and acrid smell of deployed airbags rushing at him. "Stay with me," Mason shouted, fumbling for the seatbelt release. The man groaned, blood streaking his temple. Mason hooked his arms under the stranger's shoulders, dragging him clear of the wreck just as a faint hiss of leaking fuel reached his ears. Seconds later, the car erupted into flames. Mason lay back in the gravel, coughing, the stranger's weight heavy across his lap. The man's eyes fluttered open, pale blue under the grime. "You pulled me out," he rasped. Mason nodded, still catching his breath. "Name's Mason. Ambulance is on the way." The stranger winced as he tried to sit up. "Name's Hawk," he said, his voice low but steady. Mason noticed the heavy leather jacket crumpled nearby, half covered in dirt. He reached for it, intending to keep it from the flames, and that's when he saw it. The unmistakable winged skull patch of the Hell's Angels. Mason froze. He'd heard the stories, seen the headlines, but the man in front of him didn't look like trouble now. Hawk caught his gaze, managing a faint grin. "Guess I owe you one, brother." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Mason eased back, unsure what he'd just stepped into. Saving a man's life was one thing. Saving a man with that patch, that might be another matter entirely. Paramedics arrived in a rush, lifting Hawk onto a stretcher. One of them asked Mason if he was family. "No," Mason replied, though the word felt strange in his mouth. Hawk never took his eyes off him, even as they slid him into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, Hawk called out, "Stay by your phone." Mason frowned, confused, but nodded. The wreck site quickly emptied, leaving him standing alone beside his idling truck, the blackened skeleton of the sedan still smoldering in the ditch. Driving home, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by a steady hum of unease. He told himself it was just another good deed, wrong place, right time. But as he pulled into his driveway, he couldn't shake the image of that patch. Mason had no ties to bikers, no interest in their world. Still, he couldn't deny a flicker of curiosity about the man who'd just told him to keep his phone close. That night, Mason sat at the kitchen table, nursing a coffee while his son, Evan, worked on homework. He didn't mention the wreck. No sense worrying an 8-year-old with talk of car fires and near misses. But when his phone buzzed just after 9 p.m., he felt his pulse jump. The message was short. "Appreciate what you did. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. Iron Horse Diner." No name, no number showing. Mason stared at it for a long moment, weighing the risk. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but something told him this wasn't a request he could ignore. "Everything okay, Dad?" Evan asked, looking up from his math problems. Mason forced a smile. "Yeah, buddy. Just someone saying thanks." But inside, he knew this was no ordinary thank you. And somehow, it felt like the start of something he didn't yet understand. The next day, Mason pulled into the Iron Horse Diner lot a few minutes early. The place was small, with chrome trim and big windows fogged from the morning chill. As he stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee wrapped around him. Hawk was already there, sitting in a corner booth, his head bandaged but his posture solid. Across from him sat two other men in leather, their jackets bearing the same patch. They watched Mason with unreadable expressions as Hawk waved him over. "Sit," Hawk said. "Meet Diesel and Cutter." Mason slid into the booth, the leather squeaking under him. "You saved my life yesterday," Hawk began. "And in our world, that means something." Diesel leaned forward, voice low. "Means you're part of the circle now, whether you like it or not." Mason swallowed, realizing he'd stepped into a world where debts weren't just paid, they were honored. Mason's coffee arrived, steaming in a thick white mug. He wrapped his hands around it, more for something to do than warmth. Hawk leaned back, wincing slightly at the pull on his bandages. "You didn't just pull me from a wreck," he said. "You stepped in when most folks would have kept driving." Cutter's gaze stayed fixed on Mason, weighing him. "We don't forget that kind of thing." Mason shifted in his seat. "I didn't do it for thanks," Hawk smirked. "Good. Then you won't mind if we return the favor someday." Mason frowned. "Don't think I'll need it." Diesel chuckled, low and rough. "Nobody thinks they'll need it until they do." The conversation felt like a poker game where Mason didn't know the rules. Still, when Hawk slid a business card across the table, Mason took it. On the back, in heavy black ink, "One call. Anytime." The meeting ended as abruptly as it had begun. Hawk shook Mason's hand firmly, the other two nodding in silent acknowledgement before sliding out of the booth. Outside, the three mounted their bikes, the engines snarling to life. Mason stood in the doorway, watching them ride off in formation, the sound fading into the distance. He slipped the card into his wallet, telling himself he'd never use it. Back home, Evan was building a Lego tower on the living room floor. "You were gone long," he said. Mason smiled faintly. "Just met some people." That night, as he lay in bed, the low growl of those engines replayed in his head. It wasn't fear exactly, more a sense that a door had opened into another world. And even though he hadn't asked for it, he'd stepped through without meaning to. 3 days later, a cold rain swept through town. Mason was hauling groceries to his truck when he heard raised voices in the parking lot. 2 men had cornered an elderly cashier, accusing her of scratching their car. Mason didn't know her well, but she'd always been kind to Evan, slipping him extra candy at checkout. He stepped in, keeping his voice calm. "Why don't we all take a breath?" One of the men shoved him hard enough to make him stumble. Something inside Mason shifted. Without thinking, he reached for his phone and the card in his wallet. He didn't even have to dial. The number connected on the first ring. "Hawk," came the voice on the other end. "Where are you?" Mason told him. Less than 10 minutes later, the deep rumble of motorcycles filled the lot. The 2 men froze as 6 leather-clad riders pulled in, engines idling like thunder. Hawk swung off his bike, his boots splashing in the rain. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying weight. The 2 men muttered something about a misunderstanding, retreating quickly under the watchful eyes of the riders. The cashier gripped Mason's arm, whispering, "I don't know who they are, but thank you." Hawk clapped Mason on the shoulder. "Told you, part of the circle now." Diesel handed Mason a plastic bag. "Groceries," he said simply. Mason blinked. It was everything he'd just bought, plus extras. "We look after our own," Hawk added. The riders left as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving the parking lot quiet except for the rain. Driving home, Mason glanced at the bag on the seat beside him. He realized that whether he liked it or not, the line between his life and theirs was already blurring. And deep down, part of him didn't mind. That weekend, Mason was at the park with Evan when the sound of approaching engines made him look up. A small group of riders coasted in, parking under the shade of an oak. Hawk waved them over. "Heard there's a fundraiser for the Kids League," he said. Mason nodded, trying to keep it going. "Budget's tight." Without a word, Cutter pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to the event organizer. "From the club," he said simply. "No speeches, no attention-seeking, just a quiet act." Mason watched the organizer's stunned expression, the way parents exchanged glances. Later, as Evan chased a ball across the grass, Hawk stood beside Mason. "We don't just ride for ourselves," he said. "We ride for those who can't." Mason realized that these men, feared by many, carried a code every bit as strict as any soldiers. And now, somehow, that code included him. It was late on a Thursday when Mason's phone rang. Hawk's voice came through, low and serious. "Need a hand. Tonight." Mason hesitated, glancing toward Evan, asleep on the couch. Hawk added, "It's not trouble, just help moving something important." Mason called a neighbor to watch his boy and drove out to the address Hawk texted. A warehouse sat at the edge of an industrial park, dimly lit except for a row of bikes out front. Inside, stacks of boxed-up winter coats and food filled the space. "Community center lost funding," Hawk explained. "We're delivering these before the cold sets in." For the next 2 hours, Mason loaded trucks alongside men twice his size, each working with quiet efficiency. By the end, his arms ached, but the feeling in his chest was lighter than it had been in years. Hawk clapped him on the back. "Told you." Circles about more than protection. The next morning, Mason dropped Evan at school and headed to work. On the way, he spotted a moving truck stuck in the mud near a narrow bridge. A young couple stood beside it, clearly overwhelmed. Mason pulled over without thinking, offering to tow them out. As he worked, the man explained they just moved to town with their newborn and didn't know anyone. Mason gave them his number, in case you need a hand. Driving away, he realized he was starting to act the way Hawk and the others did, quietly stepping in, expecting nothing back. That evening, a small bag of groceries appeared on his porch with no note. Mason smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was. The circle wasn't just about him receiving. It was about learning to keep it going. And little by little, that code was becoming his own. Saturday brought unexpected visitors. Mason was in the garage fixing Evan's bike when the low growl of engines rolled up the street. 5 riders pulled in, Hawk at the front. "Got something for you," Hawk said, handing Mason a sturdy leather jacket. The back bore no patch, but the front carried a small stitched emblem, a discreet mark of trust. "Not a member," Hawk said, "but it says you ride with us in spirit." Mason ran his fingers over the stitching, feeling the weight of the gift. Evan's eyes widened. "Dad, you look like them." Hawk crouched to meet the boy's gaze. "Your dad's one of the good ones, kid." They stayed for coffee, trading stories while Evan listened wide-eyed. For the first time, Mason felt less like an outsider and more like a man who belonged, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he was willing to do. 1 week later, Mason was closing up at work when a customer stormed in, shouting about a mistake on his bill. The man's voice grew louder, his anger spilling into threats. Mason stayed calm, but the situation was escalating fast. Then, through the glass door, he saw them, 2 familiar silhouettes in leather jackets. Hawk and Diesel stepped inside, their presence filling the room without a word spoken. The angry man took one look and backed off, muttering as he left. Hawk grinned. "Guess we returned the favor again." Mason shook his head, half amused, half amazed. "Do you follow me everywhere?" Hawk shrugged. "Sometimes the circle watches, even when you don't see it." Driving home that night, Mason understood that being part of their world wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about knowing someone always had your back, no questions asked. As autumn settled in, Mason found himself spending more weekends with the riders. Sometimes it was charity runs, other times just riding the open road. Evan perched safely behind him on short trips. Hawk never pushed him to join officially, but the respect was there. One crisp Sunday, they stopped at a roadside diner. A waitress Mason had never met brought over pie on the house, whispering, I heard what you did for Hawk. Mason realized news of that day had traveled farther than he thought. On the ride home, Evan leaned against him and said, I like them, Dad. They're like uncles who ride motorcycles. Mason laughed, but deep down he knew his son was right. The circle wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to both of them. And in a way, it felt like family had found them when they weren't even looking. One rainy evening, Mason was driving home when headlights flashed in the distance, swerving wildly before disappearing into a ditch. He pulled over fast, grabbing his flashlight. A teenage boy sat behind the wheel, dazed but unhurt. The car was stuck deep in the mud. My phone's dead, the boy muttered, panic in his voice. Mason helped him out and checked the road. Too slick to tow alone. Without hesitation, he pulled out Hawk's card and called. 10 minutes later, the growl of engines broke through the rain. Hawk's crew arrived with chains, pulling the car free in minutes. The boy's parents showed up soon after, hugging him tightly. Hawk shot Mason a knowing look. Circle never sleeps. As Mason watched them ride away, he realized he wasn't just calling for help anymore. He was helping decide who else the circle would protect. Weeks later, Hawk invited Mason and Evan to a holiday run, a convoy delivering toys to children's shelters. The group gathered at dawn, the air crisp and bright. Evan rode in the lead van, his eyes wide at the endless line of bikes stretching behind. At each stop, children ran to greet them, their laughter cutting through the winter chill. Mason carried boxes alongside Hawk, feeling the weight of every gift and every smile. When the run ended, Hawk handed Evan a small leather vest, stitched with the same discreet emblem as Mason's jacket. Now you're both part of it, Hawk said. Evan beamed, wearing it proudly. Driving home, Mason glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. It struck him that what started with pulling a stranger from a wreck had become something much larger. A legacy of loyalty and kindness that Evan would grow up inside. That winter was easier than any before. The circle checked in often. Sometimes it was Hawk stopping by with coffee. Other times a quiet envelope left on the porch when work was slow. Mason learned to return the kindness, fixing a neighbor's fence, plowing driveways, and helping the food bank on weekends. The jacket Hawk had given him hung by the door, not as decoration, but as a reminder. Belonging came with responsibility. One snowy night, Mason found himself explaining it to Evan. It's not about the patch or the bikes, he said. It's about making sure the people in your life know they can count on you. Evan nodded, thoughtful. Like you could count on Hawk that day in the parking lot? Mason smiled. Exactly. The boy grinned. Then I want to be like that too. Mason felt proud. The circle's lessons were already taking root in the next generation. Spring brought an unexpected knock at Mason's door. A man he'd never seen stood there, holding a small gift bag. You don't know me, the man said. But my son told me you pulled him from a ditch last winter. I wanted to say thank you. Inside the bag was a simple silver keychain engraved with the words "Pay it forward." Mason turned it over in his palm, the weight familiar. He realized the circle wasn't limited to the bikers. It was expanding, spilling into the wider community. Later that week, Hawk stopped by. Heard you've been doing some recruiting, Hawk teased. Mason laughed. Guess it's contagious. Hawk's grin was genuine. That's the point, brother. Keep it going, and one day you won't even know where the circle ends. Mason knew then he didn't need to. The important thing was making sure it never broke. On a warm summer evening, Mason and Evan sat on the porch, the sound of crickets mixing with the faint rumble of distant engines. Evan leaned against him. Do you think Hawk will come by soon? Mason smiled. Maybe. But even if he doesn't, he's still here. Evan frowned playfully. How? Mason looked out at the fading light. Every time someone helps without asking for anything back, that's the circle. Every time we step in, that's him. That's all of them. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. Then I'm going to keep it going, Dad. Mason put an arm around him, feeling the weight of both promise and pride. Pulling a stranger from a wreck had changed everything. Some debts aren't paid in money. They're paid in loyalty, in trust, and in the way you choose to ride through life. Mason thought he was saving one man. Instead, he found a family. One act pulled him into a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by loyalty. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. So more tales of courage, kindness, and brotherhood ride your way.